Hello and welcome. I'm Lorianne Lumby, and this is the second week of our online course, Unchained. In this week's gathering, we focus on the topic of dependency. And in order to really understand how that fits within this conversation about the patriarchy, we have to go back to last week's lesson where we unfolded some of the theories around the advent of patriarchy, or at least how patriarchy came to be known in portions of the world where it previously was not being lived out. Last week, we spoke a lot about Riane Eisler and her work, Chalice and the Blade, Sacred Partnership, and her other research into specifically this topic of patriarchy, matriarchy, egalitarianism, or as she calls it, I believe the word she uses is fidelity. And her theories blew apart previous understandings about human beings, how they lived and how they interacted with one another. The research that she undertook focused its attentions on the Mediterranean basin, along with I guess I would say what today we would call the Middle East, the lower parts of Asia, so India, southern China, Eastern Europe, or at least the southernmost areas of Eastern Europe, North Africa, and also the jungles of South America. And in her studies, she discovered evidence of and evidence of past civilizations and proof of contemporary civilizations that were living in peaceful harmony, contentment, collaboration, and with a model that was not hierarchical. So it wasn't matriarchal, meaning women privileged. It wasn't patriarchal, meaning male privileged, but it was egalitarian, meaning all are equal, treated as equal, honored as equal, celebrated as equal. She provides evidence in her research of communities that exist within that egalitarian structure, and that the results of that egalitarian structure are peaceful coexistence. She also challenged what at the time, which this would have been early 80s, was this idea that before patriarchy, there was matriarchy. Her research overturned that and suggested it wasn't matriarchy, because that is still some definition of human being privileged over another. It still implies a hierarchy of sorts. Instead, her research, her thesis, her hypothesis is that specifically in the Mediterranean basin and in I guess it would be northern parts of India, southern parts of China, people were living under an egalitarian model, and therefore were living a peaceful coexistence. The question that she then brings forth is, okay, so here were these cultures that were living in peaceful coexistence. They had embraced an egalitarian structure and found the benefits of that. What happened? What happened that patriarchy was able to come in and take the power away from the all and give it to the few? We don't have any proof of this, but the theory, the working theory, is that climate change was what eventually led communities to either give into neighboring tribes that were patriarchal or tribes that were willing to let go of their egalitarian model in favor of a hierarchical, male-dominated structure. And what supports that theory is that in that area that she was researching, food was abundant. These are temperate zones where people aren't suffering under the hardship of winters. They're not suffering under the blazing heat of desert climates, but are instead living in a world that provides for them, where there is abundance in animal, plant, water, those things that we need to survive. And that perhaps something happened that changed that access to abundance. In scripture, we hear stories of times of famine in Northern Africa, times of famine in what today we would call Palestine, Israel, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Jordan. Places that were previously abundant, but for some reason were suffering loss, lack, hunger, perhaps starvation. It is perhaps this hunger that first whittled away at the trust and belief in an egalitarian kind of structure. As we talked about last week, at the heart of patriarchy, the root of patriarchy, foundation of patriarchy is fear. And what greater fear than that upon which our lives are dependent? If we don't have food, if we don't have water, we will die. And human beings, by our nature, are afraid of death. We are programmed to survive. We are driven to seek the means of survival. So if those means are no longer abundant and we fall into that place of fear, what are we willing to give up for the promises of provision, for the promises of protection? This, I believe, is how patriarchy was able to find its roots. Whether it be from within the tribe or outside of the tribe. Something came along and said, We see you are hungry. We see you are afraid. We promise to provide for and protect you. But in exchange for your power. Patriarchy is built on dependency. Dependency is an uneven, inequitable demonstration of power. One having power, one not having power. Dependency, in this case, is predicated, in most cases, is predicated on false promises. If I do this for you, then you must do this for me. A simple definition of dependency is when one person relies on another for support, decision-making, or validation. Dependency robs us of our autonomy. Dependency to an outside perceived protector, an outside perceived provider, deprives us of our executive function. Promises are made, and over time, our ability to make decisions is whittled away. The voice of the dependent must be silenced so that the one in power might maintain their power. Dependency requires obedience. Dependency requires subservience. Dependency requires that we be less than the power that be, and ultimately less than our own selves. Dependency requires sacrifice. It requires atonement. It requires fealty. And for thousands of years, we have been living in this unhealthy, inequitable, dependent relationship on an outside perceived power that promises provision and protection. When we look at the advent of patriarchy, we can see all kinds of examples of how that outside perceived authority is defined. One of the first things that happens when one kind of structure takes over, when one kind of cultural structure takes over another, first thing that happens is they take over and redefine the gods of the now subservient class. In times before patriarchy, there was a god and a goddess. Before the god and the goddess, there was source. Under the patriarchy, there is a god. A god that is made in the image of the conquering ruling class. As we have witnessed this in, gosh, pretty much all the world religions. This God is male. This God is warlike. This God is punitive, judgmental, makes promises about provision and protection, but only after worship and sacrifice, atonement, and fealty. This God is one whose approval needs to be earned and whose approval can be taken away. This is a God who chooses sides. There are the chosen ones and the enemy. Under patriarchy, the rulers are not a collaborative participation of the common people. The ruler is a king or a czar or a pope or a warlord or a chief or a president or a prime minister. Under patriarchy, the masculine is favored, and it is the qualities of the masculine that are, well, again, favored. Masculine qualities that have been defined as action, power, value, determined by how hard we work, what we produce, how much power we have, how much money we have. Masculine qualities that are about power over, masculine qualities that inflict dependency. Masculine qualities that then inform, they don't inform who we are, they inform our conditioned self. The qualities that tell us how to be. And under patriarchy, the feminine is defined by patriarchal standards. Patriarchy defines what beauty is, what shape or size is preferred. Patriarchy defines a woman's place in society or no place. Patriarchy decides the duties of a woman, what she is availed of. Are women allowed to be educated? Can they receive schooling? What kind of jobs can they have? What positions of power might they hold? Under a clearly defined patriarchy, so too are those roles clearly defined. And again, it's all predicated on this idea of dependency. The lesser than are dependent on those in power. They are dependent upon those in power for provision, safety, protection. But as we know, as patriarchy hopefully is on its last legs, those promises are untrue. At no time throughout history has patriarchy been the bearer of provision. It claims to be the bearer of protection, but at what cost? And is war really a means of protection? Or is that the kind of protection that we want? Is that the kind of protection that provides for us? The promises of the patriarchy are lies. And history has shown us that. And yet each and every one of us have suffered under those lies, have suffered under those false promises, have suffered by the conditioning that does not give us the freedom to be who we truly are, but instead tells us who to be and what is expected of us. The patriarchy is living in us. And it is one of the greatest sources of limitation. And if we seek our own liberation, if we seek our own freedom, we need to take the time to identify the ways in which patriarchy has influenced or conditioned us, how that conditioning no longer serves us, if it ever did, and to begin to do the work of unraveling from that conditioning. So to help support us in that exploration, we're going to enter into a reflection activity. I'm going to pull up the handout. So I've pulled up the questions that I'm inviting into our reflection period. And allow this to go wherever it needs to go for you. Allow yourself to be present to this in whatever way you feel called. If you have your notebook or journal with you, you may find that you want to write some of these reflections, record your thoughts. And when we've had time to move through these reflections on our own, then we'll enter into our own sharing and discussion. So just some prompts. After hearing this week's lesson, reflect on the ways in which you have experienced dependence on the patriarchy. Reflecting perhaps on some of these questions. How have you placed belief in a hierarchical, male-run institution, organization, or individual? How or have you placed belief in that? Where have you found yourself in the lower levels of hierarchy? Give examples of that How did it make you feel? Where have you found yourself let down by a hierarchical institution or environment? Perhaps experiencing it in ways that you have felt dismissed, ignored, belittled, unheard. Examine your relationship with your parents, your pastors, your teachers, your employers. Where have you witnessed patriarchal hierarchy at work in these relationships? What steps have you taken or would you like to take to begin to take your power back? So I'm going to stop the recording. And I'm going to leave the handout up if you want to reference this as you're reflecting. It's 7:16 now. Why don't we go until 7:40? That'll give us 20-25 minutes for our reflection. And then we'll come back together at 7:40 for discussion and sharing. So I'm going to turn off my